it going, Carol? Can you hear it? Can you hear it, Carol? All right. Okay. We're going to do a little something different here, hopefully. We've been here for how many symposiums now? Is this the 11th? 11th, okay. So we all know a lot about Francis Marion, so I'm going to try to do something different. What's that? A bomb?
A mic so I can hear you.
Oh. Most of you know that I'm an archaeologist. So I like to look at history in the past, using not only the documents, but I like to look at things from material culture and from an archaeological perspective. And archaeology is part of anthropology. So when I went off to do my dissertation, anthropologists weren't so interested in Francis Marion as a person, but more as Francis Marion, a figure and as a leader and as a person who interacted with the people he was supporting and the people who supported him. So is that focused? Is that focused at all? Okay.
Right.
Here it's not. So let's what I want to do today, and my whole point will be just as a kind of an example of how we might learn something new about Francis Marion by using a different perspective than just looking at the history in the documents. Well, we all know who Francis Marion is, and what I want to focus in on is this period of when he became a swamp fox, which is from about August of 1780 to around April 1781. That was his pure guerrilla, irregular warfare period. One of the little things you might think about Marion is that he had quite a career after that, and actually he was very good at not doing partisan things. He was very good at being a district leader, and during the latter part of the war, we don't pay a lot of attention to that because we're most interested in that swamp fox period. So what is a partisan? At that time, that word in the 18th century meant just any soldier who was a light infantryman or a cavalryman or someone who was very mobile. Didn't really have that sort of guerrilla warfare kind of terminology at that time. But since that time, partisan has become a general term to mean guerrilla tactics with rapid mobility, ambushes, raids, offensively, on a tactical level, very offensive, but in a strategic posture, you're on the defense. You can't win wars being a guerrilla. You have to advance into regular warfare, which he did, in order to go on the offense and to take and hold land, which partisans don't generally do. Now, there's two kinds, and this is different kinds of wars. I know Scott Aiken would probably call it asymmetrical warfare. That's the new buzzword. Regular warfare, guerrilla warfare, insurgency, small wars, all of these sort of things. And this type of warfare goes back to the Chinese. Sun Tzu wrote about deception and how to fight and to deceive your enemy. Fabius, Yanni, Clausewitz, all the famous military theorists in the past talked about how to fight the guerrilla warfare and how to defeat guerrilla warfare. One of the most famous, of course, being Mao. Now, partisans need two things to be successful. You are not a successful partisan unless you have the success and the support of the people, the population. So here's a couple of quotes. The most important one being at the bottom, which was Daniel Green's letter. Until we have a more permanent army who can collect it in the field, we must present to keep a partisan warfare, to preserve our tight, etc. So this connection to the people is critical. That's number one. Number two, you got to have a base camp. As Mao says, a base camp is as necessary as a human body. After exhausting the activities, you used to rest. You need a place where you can rest and refit. We like to think of Marion as galloping across the countryside, going from camp to camp to camp to camp. But actually, during this period, from August of 1781, after the fall of Camden, up to around April when the camp was destroyed, he always maintained a base camp where he was able to return. And we're going to kind of see that as we go along. But the important implication of this is you need these two things. You need the people in the area, and you need a base camp. So when you look at that, and you think about this in an anthropological perspective, like I do, you start thinking about who these people were. And you look and think about not only as just the fighters, but that support of the people are the local citizens that were supporting Francis Marion. And in a particular area. And in this case, that particular area was Snow's Island. So his little camp was around Snow's Island. And all the people around Snow's Island were part of a pretty strong Whig community. That is, they supported the American Revolution. And if there's some evidence, we'll talk about where those who didn't so much support him were sort of forced out of the area, let's say. There is a loyalist commander by the name of Robert Gray who wrote a report about the war, and he described the American Revolution, or the South Carolina backcountry, around 1781 to 82, as a piece of patchwork. What he meant by that was that there were these little pockets. Here was a stronghold of Whig resistance, which was around Snow's Island. But at the very edge of that was another stronghold of loyalist support, and that was up the Little PD. Orangeburg, for instance, was known as a pretty strong loyalist area. And as the war progressed, these areas became more and more rarefied. That is, more people who lived in the area, whatever side you were on, whether it was a Whig area, it became more Whig because the loyalists in the area were going to be kind of driven out, and likewise around Orangeburg, the Whigs were going to be driven out. So that these little areas became like a piece of patchwork or a quilt. So, looking at this and put it, for me as an archaeologist, trying to put this on the landscape was about what I was trying to do in my dissertation. That is, I wanted to go out to a place called Snow's Island and see how all this worked together and see if it was true. Was there a community there? Was there any evidence of that on the landscape that I could look at and connect all that together? So we're looking at the strategic area with guerrillas to carry out their duties of self-preservation. All right, what is Snow's Island? Well, it's not an island. It's highland swamp. It's surrounded by the PD River on the north, and let's see if I can screw things up. Here we go. Good. On the north and east by the PD. On the north and northwest by the Lynch's River at that time Creek. I always say that because I once gave a presentation. Someone afterwards came up and said, "Lynch's River?" I said, "Yes, it is," but back then it was called the Creek. So mouth of Lynch, into the mouth, there's Lynch's entrance into the PD, and then Clark's Creek, which breaks off, comes down and goes back into and empties back into the PD. These three rivers make up Snow's Island. Here we are, a larger perspective, showing you Kingston, which was is Conway today, Britain's Neck, right here, Snow's Island, Johnsonville will be about right there. Now, this was not only was this a good place strategically to hold, to have, because it had the support of the people there, but also, and not only because it was a swamp, we like to think that Marion was always hiding out in the swamps, but it was a place where you could control access fairly easily. You had 4 major and strategically important ferry crossings, which if you control those, you could control the Snow's Island. You could seal off access. The first of those was Witherspoon's Ferry here, which was where Marion took charge of the Williamsburg militia in August of 1780. And then the one he often used, Port's Ferry, crossing over to Britain's Neck from the north. Excuse me, that's Port's Ferry here. Britain's Ferry to the south of Snows Island, and then any access to the Kingston area, to North Carolina, and to Georgetown was the Potato Head Ferry here. So by having all these people in an intelligence sense knowing and controlling access to that, he had a pretty secure place as his base of operation. Now, unfortunately, my committee wanted me to prove that point. It's a nice theory, Steve. Let's see. Give me some evidence of how you came about that. So I spent quite a bit of time researching the people who lived in that area. The point being to demonstrate that these people were supported the Whig rebellion and that they were interrelated as a community. They operated as a community. And then I went out and did some archaeology and tried to find sites that mirrored that or provided evidence of that. So I looked at usual county histories, the usual sources, but I also spent a lot of time with plat maps and audited accounts, pension applications, petitions. Petitions were very important, and genealogy, and of course any primary accounts that I could find. All right, and here's just some examples. Now the petitions are were pretty critical, especially this one here, the Britain's Neck Protestant petition. It was signed in 1777. Well, if you're going to try to look for people on the landscape and know that they were in the area, you've got a nicely defined area here, Britain's Neck. And all the Protestants signed a petition for a church at that in 1776, right at the time of the Revolution. So anybody on that list lived on Britain's Neck or near there, and I can pinpoint, I can go into the plats and try to find those people. They were also afterwards to make sure that they were still retained in the area, 1814. And then there were other petitions that became pretty important. Those are all washing out. Okay, so George warned Steve, don't spend a lot of time with genealogy. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time with genealogy. Take my word for it. I just want to give you some examples of what Alexia has already demonstrated clearly was well, she didn't use this word, but incestuous nature of the backcountry during the Revolution. And really, what I'm going to be pointing out to is my chapter 3, which demonstrated the community, was probably one of the most mind-numbing chapters in all dissertation history. Because I had to go through all of these people who lived there. I had to find them on the landscape with plats or some other thing. I had to, figure out who they were and make sure that they were there and that they supported the revolution and the Marion's cause. So there was, page after page of people. And you get into these mind-boggling problems of dealing with these kinds of documents when you have things like the Goddards, which was important because Bass placed Marion's camp at Goddard's plantation. Marion, again, was not out in the middle of an empty swamp. He was usually camping at plantations where he could get resources and where people knew, a place that his friends could know where he was. So he was living not as isolated as we'd like to be, but he was in a place which could be protected. So here we are, the Goddard family. The Goddards, Francis Goddard, who has William Goddard, which was the plantation that Marion was supposedly at by Bass, whether or not he was or not. All right, the Goddard, and then William Goddard had a son, Francis. Francis, the senior, had William, Francis, and Frances, the female Frances, C-E-S. And then Francis had a son named William. So, and they usually don't put the third in their audited accounts, or they don't do that like that on the. And you might have a will, for instance, with 2 or 3 Francis or William Goddards mixed up in there. Okay, So that takes care of your family, but what about, was there any connections? Was there anybody living within, okay, here. This Francis married a Britons of Britain's Neck. If you go over across Britain's Neck, you're going to find in this period of time, Britain after Britain after Britain right next to each other. They all moved into the area as brothers. There's like 5 of them. And they all bought properties and they sold them back and forth to each other. And they married into the Goddards, and they married into the Snows of Snow's Island. And so you have these connections. You build all these connections. And so you look at not only that, but you look at wills, and you see that they proved each other's wills, they sued each other, they signed petitions together. They did all this stuff which proved that how interconnected they were. To show, again, that there were families there that were living as a community. Another neat thing about this is the churches. Now, we don't spend a lot of time on churches, but churches were very important during that period of time. And we like to think, as archaeologists, that people don't cross rivers very much because it's very dangerous. But people were crossing the PD River just to go to church. It's amazing. You know, we had that wonderful picture of Marion going across the river. And if you ever, I know Bob's been on the PD. It's dangerous. You know, I worry every time I go across it because that boat goes out. You're going to go downstream many miles. But they were doing that just to go to church. It's an amazing period of time. But the churches were all, of course, you were neighbors with people that you went to church with. So that was another community plan. All right. Petitions, I think we've already talked about that. I think I can cross over that in a minute. Plats. All right. Yeah, everybody likes plats. I've got some friends who just constantly on me during my research. Look at the plats. Look at the plats. I invite you to read a dissertation from about 1930-35 on a dissertation by a person who looked at plat research and how plats were made. And you will realize exactly how inaccurate they are and how they overlap. And we're going to talk, well, actually, I can talk about that now. But unless, in this area, unless you had an anchor, which was usually the river, the PD River, or Clark's Creek or something, with a big bend in it, you had no clue where you were on the landscape at that time. A lot of the plats just have in the middle of nowhere against no one else's property. So you couldn't really use that as your first measure. You can find a name, know that they were in the community somewhere with the petition maybe, and then link them with a plat, which was very helpful. But you couldn't simply start out with a plat always and know what's going on. For instance, this plat here is Thomas Port's plat. It's right across the river from Snow's Island. In fact, that's a big bend in the river of Snow's Island. This is Dunham's Bluff. A gentleman by the name of Dunham was there during the American Revolution. Prior to the Revolution, Thomas Port owned that. There's no connection between Thomas Port and Dunham in terms of purchasing the property. But we know this is Dunham's property. Now, another example. If you try to place on the landscape a guy named James Mickey, anybody ever run into James Mickey? You might have. Charles. James Mickey was one of these early speculators who bought a lot of land. A Miles group, but not such a big Miles group. Bought a lot of land everywhere. So his name shows up a lot of places, especially around Georgetown. But you don't find him if you go to the petitions or to the plat maps and just try to look for that area. But after the Revolution, he was a loyalist. Probably never set foot near Snow's Island in his life. After the Revolution, he was trying to get some compensation, went through the courts, and so he had bought some property in that area. So they went back after the Revolution to see what he actually owned. And so this square thing here is his property. And it interferes with, this is Lynch's Creek coming right here. This is Clark's Creek going out here. This is the PD. And this is William Goddard's plantation. There's no connection between William Goddard and James Mickey. And the only reason we would know James Mickey was anywhere near this area was because of what happened after the Revolution. But, again, doubtful that he was ever there. So my point is, plats are good, but don't rely on them and don't think you're going to get anywhere with them alone. You've got to connect a lot of dots before you can use them usefully. By the way, Bob, check this out. See that little thing there? See how that little island is right there? It's not there anymore, but I think that may be Scott's Lake. All right, audited accounts. Very important. I think you all know what they are. Anyone not know what an audited account was? The Americans gave receipts to people during the war with the promise that if we won, we would pay them back. So Marion, or usually Marion's adjutant, would hand out a receipt to the guy saying, here, you just provided us with 3 cattle and some corn stalks, which were good to feeding pigs, forage and fodder and beef, and here's your receipt. Kept the receipt, went to a justice of the peace after the war, and you got your money. All right, so these are very important because, again, it links the people to Marion directly. It shows the support that Marion was given by these people. And this was a neat one because it's William Snow's, one of the Snow families, and he's providing 8 head of cattle January 1st, 1781. Critical time. Marion was physically there at that time. We like to think of Marion being there a lot of the time, but we can only actually nail into the landscape during the month of late December and early January. He probably was there in November, when I can't prove that. Okay, so you build up a lot of these. So now we know William Snow, we know he owns property on Snow's Island. We know he married into the Goddards, and we know that he provided and supported Francis Marion. Well, yeah, some of the people who were loyalists got receipts too. You know, that's true. I'll give that to you. Pension records are really cool. They're always helpful. You got to use them with a lot of salt, so to speak. You can't always rely on them. But every once in a while, there's some really cool grains of truth in them that's really kind of fun. In this case, this is John Scott. And of course, he provides general run-views of Snow's Island. And he talks about his career with Francis Marion. Anyone recognize this name? Come on, David. Still on the spot. John Scott. What?
Scott's Lake.
Yeah, I'm thinking of something even more fun.
It was Lieutenant Scott at Stamford Bridge.
Excellent. Well done, David. Ding, 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 ding. Give him a prize. That's right. John Scott was at Poltroon, according to Weems, who was the one who retreated at Stamford Bridge when Marion had Watson pinned up against the bridge with the riflemen on the other side of the bridge. And Marion was coming up behind to hit Watson, and the artillery. Watson had to turn his artillery around to chase Marion back off. But they were trapped. They couldn't cross the bridge because there were riflemen on the other side. Who was the guy leading the riflemen? John Scott. And he was called a poltroon. Think about this. This is a book, most popular book besides George Washington's biography. Here you are, called a poltroon, and the most popular, a Daniel Steele novel. Your name is there. Everyone's reading this, and yet you're applying for a pension in which you say, "I was there." Stationed with 32 riflemen near the bridge with orders to fire when the enemy advanced, but retreated band outflanked. So he was blamed for that loss, and yet he put that into his pension. And Weems is really disparaged because of all the fancifulness of the novel, but every once in a while there's a nugget out there that's kind of fun to look at and connect up so you can find clues. There's something in there for everyone with Mason Weems. All right, after having done that, I was able to define the community, the Snow's Island community. I hope that, can you see a thing called a core region? Is it dark for you? Does that show up? Yeah, these are still washing up. Around the Snow's Island area, in about 5 miles in any direction, there should be a dark ring there showing the core area. The people who interacted, that I could definitely show that interacted together as a community before the war and became Whigs, and so important. Now this outer boundary here is beyond that. We don't find a lot of people we find people who support Marion. I'm not saying that, but we don't find people who interacted in a community sense with the people around Snow's Island. And of course, there's an important Cypress Creek right here, which is kind of a border between the Marion's Whig community and the Loyalists, little PD Loyalists upstream. And, right at that edge was the Battle of Blue Savannah. And one of the kids came and said, we're going to go after and rescue our father. And Marion says, we don't have any guys. And one of the brothers said, well, we're going to go anyway. And so Marion decided that maybe he should jump out in front of his troops and lead them in an attack. All right, I ended up having to divide the families into 3 tiers. The first tier are people that I could put on the landscape and knew exactly where they were by plats and other kinds of research, and all interacted together. So you've got the Ports, the Goddards, and the Griffins, and the Balloons. They all interacted. The Davises were a big family. And before and after the war, of course, they interacted as a community. Joined the same churches eventually. Sorry. The second tier families were people I could put within a 2 or 3 mile area, but I couldn't nail them to the landscape. But they were people that that I knew they interacted with Marion, lived in the area, and intermarried in terms of community. So these were second tier families. This is a Sesame Street quiz. Which name doesn't belong there? All these names are alike but one. Huh? You can't read them? No, that makes it great.
Miss Galley.
Miss Galley, right. Miss Galley lived on Muddy Creek. He lived about a mile, best I can nail him, from Snow's Island. Miss Galley would be one of the men killed or hung at Fort Mott for being Colonel Doyle's guide. Miss Galley lived in the area after the war. She wasn't chased out. But he's obviously, and the other thing about him is the family never interacted with anybody. I have no connection with Miss Galley with any of the other families who intermarried. So he was kind of an outer guy anyway. And you can speculate. Chris Swagger said I don't speculate. I love to speculate. I think he was probably a loyalist, and he was kind of rarefied out of the community during the war, and he probably went to Rome and said, hey, I know where Marion is. How's that for speculation? Chris? All right, third tier families. Third tier families were families that provided food and support for Marion with food and fodder and everything else, or they somehow were otherwise connected with the Francis Marion. But I cannot place them on the landscape other than the most general sense, but I knew they lived in the area. For instance, Warhees. The Warhees, of course, are on Catfish Creek. These are regional names. All right, so we're going to spend a little time on stuff that you like, and that's called Marion's history, war history. We'll spend a little bit of time on that.